for ratings YouTube. I'm going to put my little tree on there. I like to buy that blinky thing in the back of my gaming videos. I don't really know why. Maybe it's because they're festive. They're not always festive. I've been reading 5th edition, and I've made my way through the Player's Handbook and through the DM's Guide. I have to remember to call it the DM's Guide. My habit is to call things GM because it's a generic term, but let's face it, it's Dungeons & Dragons. Might as well say DM. And I'm working my way through the Monster Manual because I both enjoy reading monster manuals, and I also want to see how they may have tinkered with some of the classics. I also picked myself up a couple of PDFs from DM's Guild, the DM's Guild I think it was, that will let me look at how they are interpreting the ability to play any monster from the standard 5th edition monster manual as a class. That should be entertaining. But when I was going through the DM's Guide, they offer a lot of alternative rules, and it's much more set up as the old classic 1st edition Player's Handbook and DM's Guide was. The Player's Handbook has all the stuff for your classes, your species, your spells, and stuff like that, and they've put all of the stuff in the DM's Guide that are your magic items and your alternative rules and suggestions and ideas on how to run a game. There's a lot more of that in the 5th edition than there was in the 1st edition, because let's face it, the 5th edition is being based upon a system that's 40 years old now, so they've got a lot more things to say and maybe some useful advice. And I do admit that some of the advice in there was quite good. But I got to the chapter where they talked about like siege weapons, and it's not big. I mean, it's not a big section. They're not setting up 5th edition as some kind of really intense, tactical game, but you really kind of have to have some sort of idea of how many hit points a wall might have and how many hit points of damage a siege weapon does, just in case you find yourself in a situation of being in a siege. And they talked about the ballista, catapult, cannons, and I think trebuchets. Yes, I think that's the 4 things they thought of, more or less. That was the categories they put them into. And I was really disappointed with how they wrote them for 2 reasons. They presented them as requiring multiple rounds to operate, which makes absolute sense. Getting a ballista into a firing condition and then being able to fire it and then pulling that lever and you firing, a 6-foot bolt at something is not a fast process. I have no problem with the fact that they built that into the little stat block. But they didn't seem to mention, and I checked, that their crew weapons, it is conceivable that one person can run a ballista or a trebuchet or a catapult or a cannon, but it's going to take more time than you think it is going to take unless you have a team. If you have a team, then you can turn around a cannon pretty fast, or a trebuchet or a ballista, but they're really meant to be run by teams. Heck, even a lot of what we think of as modern firearms really need, like if machine guns really need a support person to help the person that's firing the machine gun maintain and operate and keep the ammo flowing and things like that. So heavy weapons tend to have crews. Even modern artillery does. So I was a little disappointed about that, because that should have been baked into the block. Like how many team members, and if you don't have this many, it will add so many rounds, or to, what I mean? That would make sense. But the other thing that disappointed me was the damage. Now, one of the nice things, they give both the dice range, like X number of dice, X, D, Y, whatever the combination happens to be, but they also give the average. And that's very convenient if you don't want to take your time to roll dice. Just use the average. Go for it, okay? But the average damage seemed remarkably low to me. Now, I think mechanically I kind of understand what they're talking about, because if you make them super weapons, then they're going to be afraid that they'll abuse them. The problem is they're very large, they're very complex, they need teams, and the situations where a player character group is probably going to have access to them and have the ability to use them properly, I think are real corner cases. So the chances that they will be abused are fairly rare. At least That's how I'm calling it. I can't see them being an everyday kind of thing. Um, and their damage was like, I think the average damage on a number of them was 44 points. Think about that for a second. 44 hit points from a cannon. Even an early cannon, which isn't going to get the same kind of pressure that the later cannons would, is still should be doing more than 44 hit points. Because if your average fighter, okay, let's take your average fighter, 10th level fighter. If you take average hit points, you get a D10. First level, you get max, and say they've got a +2 for their con. Okay, they put strength in as opposed to con. All right, I tend to play my dwarves with a high con and a lower strength. I tend to play my humans with a higher strength and a lower con. Just always how I've done it. So we'll say they got 12 hit points at first level, and then they got, we'll do the average, 7 for every other level. So that's 49 plus 12, that's 61. So they got 61 hit points at 10th level. I think that's low because you may invest more in your con. You may take the chance and roll and do better. We just said they got 61. So if you get hit by a cannon, that's 44 hit points. Now you can use the optional rule of massive damage, which would be very appropriate for being hit with a siege weapon. I think I would bake that in to the siege weapon stats. Don't necessarily use the massive damage optional rule in D&D very often. There has to be a justification for it. And I think being hit with the cannon would be one of the instances when making someone roll against, make a save to see if they just had a hole blown through them or like a limb sheared off. That's very appropriate to have that done. But even if they make the save and they've just taken 44 hit points and they're, for some strange reason, still standing, they shouldn't be. They should have been blown back like that little paper football that you do when you play on the cafeteria table when you're a kid. Yeah, you get hit with a cannonball, you're going for a ride. And it should be hitting the people behind them. It should be a line weapon if it's fired into a party, into a crowd. It should just dictate, and they even have a nice little rule for figuring out the average number of people hit by a line or a cone, which I think was a nice option in the DM's guide. So that should be a line weapon, and it should just be mowing people down. There should just now be a pathway through that crowd that didn't exist a second ago. And screaming people. And the first guy, he's probably not screaming. He's probably very, very dead. And bits of him may be in the second guy. They just really undervalue the danger of a trebuchet throwing, a 40-pound rock over a wall. Boom! That's got a lot of force. Or a container of fire. You know what I mean? Those things happened, and they're very dangerous. And cannons can fire Chainshot, which is even worse. That was originally designed to take out like masts, but Chainshot fired into a crowd is going to be brutal. Or Grape Shot, you've turned your cannon into a giant shotgun. And now there's just a cone of bodies. And that's what it should be doing. It really needs to be the devastating weapons that's available. It should be as terrifying to a 10th level party as a high level wizard firing a fireball at them is, or any other energy ball weapon, energy ball type spell. So I was disappointed how they handled them. But understanding why the rules are written where they are, I would probably increase the damage a little bit, maybe 50% higher than they had, and I would throw in the massive damage rule for the siege weapons. So I understand. So I wouldn't want to break the system. I wouldn't want to turn them into true super weapons, but I really think they need to do more damage and have more of an effect in action than they do. So they're line weapons. So if they're fired, the cannon hits, boom, 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 that goes in a line. Same with the trebuchet. You fire that into a crowd, it's going to land, and it's very likely, depending on the kind of missile it is, very likely to hit and roll. So you could do math not just to the folks that are at the point of impact, but to the people beyond it. So you're going to have the splash damage of the land, but if it keeps going, then you're going to have more of a line damage. Not far as it wouldn't go as far as a cannonball would mind, but it's still very likely to take out everyone in your entire formation, even if it's one of the classic, 15 or 19 people deep, blocks that you could have in among the Mesopotamians. Or you know what I mean? So obviously they're not facing cannons, but you got my point. It could very well blow through a lot of them even in a thick formation. So I've never run 5th edition, so I need to know from you folks that have, do you agree with me that these weapons really do seem to be underpowered and they're not taking advantage of all the possible things that those weapons can do? All right? Get my point? I hope so. Alrighty. So let's talk about siege weapons in 5th edition, or let's broaden it. Let's talk about siege weapons in D&D in entirety. I remember back in 1st edition, we found these ballistas, and they were very small. Sorry for the shaking. We're doing laundry today. They were very small in the sense that they were about 4 foot. They had about 4 foot prods, but they were made out of adamantine. It was absurd. So these things entirely, they were skeletonized and everything. They were designed to be very portable, heavy-duty ballistas that just fired like these 3-foot bolts that would just go right through things. They were designed for going after heavy-duty monsters and stuff like that. And I remember I carried one around in a bag of holding. It was in pieces, but I would take it out, I put it together, and suddenly, before you knew it, particularly surprising if someone thinks that you're not going to have a ballista, and they turn a corner and you have a ballista, they're going to be very shocked and probably very unhappy. So let's talk about siege weapons, and if you want to talk about the silly things that you may have done in your days with siege weapons, you feel free to do so as well.